Hello, greetings everyone. Thank you and welcome to Covenant Calendar Club, where we pray that you'll be richly blessed by the words that you're about to hear. And we give you praise and honor, Father, for revealing these truths to us. As we begin to investigate, we pray that you would lead us in the direction that we should go. In the name of our Messiah, we pray and give you thanks. Amen.
Amen.
So let's give our viewers a big shout out and say hello, shall we? Hello!
Hello, everyone. Shalom, shalom.
Glad you're here. Hallelujah.
Hello.
Okay, with that, Charlene, go ahead and
Okay.
take the screen.
Okay, we will do this. Okay, we're doing part 8 tonight, and yes, it is an interesting number because we have finished all of the word numbers for the moon study. There was 5 of them, and we have been reviewing that for the past 7 weeks. So tonight we're going to be doing something different for part 8, but we're still looking at everyone wants to know the truth about the moon, oh the moon. We'll be looking at some Old Testament history tonight. I've called this Yahuah's people seek after pagan gods. This is what we're going to find in the history. And you know we always have a question. And here's the question for tonight. Maybe you've all figured this out already. Why would Yahuah's people be enticed to exchange their worship for pagan gods? That is exactly what we will find tonight. And Tim is going to help me. I think we just have one slide tonight. We have our little school birdies back. And the question is, hey, Mr. Graduate, our last teaching exposed the 1611 translators as having deliberate intentions to uphold some Jewish calendar traditions.
Yes, but the translators should not have to bear all that fault for the calendar problems we are now dealing with. Today, we are going to examine the Old Testament history from Adam up to 700 BC to understand where, when, and how Yahuah's people came to adopt the sun and moon calendars. Let's start with the review.
Okay, so we're going to be looking at some different material tonight, but this is all connected to calendar, especially the moon month portion of the calendar. But we like to do a review, so we'll just back up to the 2320 Chodesh definition. I think this was about 2 lessons ago, lesson number 6, I believe that it was. And this is where we were looking at 2320 Chodesh, and that we found it had to come into alignment with Moses and Torah as Yahuah's new Chodesh month, not Yahuah's new moon or man's agenda. And I know we have some new people here tonight, so this review might be helpful, or you might just be totally lost. But anyway, we'll just carry on. The next thing that we looked at was some lexicon challenges. We had an examination of 4 theologian Hebrew lexicon study tools. We looked at Strong's. This is for 2320 Chodesh. We looked at Brown Driver Breaks and Gesenius and the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. And what we had found was that 2320 is listed by all of these writers that Chodesh means new moon, and we found that that is not true, that they have actually been following in the footsteps of Jewishness and their calculation of the moon month. But Strong's had the least amount of words, and then when we looked at Driver Briggs, he added a bit more, and Gesenius had a whole lot more to say, and when we looked at Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, he had about 2,000 words to promote the new moon as beginning the new month. I hope everybody can hear me okay. The next thing we looked at was Counsel from Moses, because we were wanting to take everything back to Torah. And this is from approximately 1450 BC, or 2,500 years after creation. And we found that his Torah calendar instructions were for all kings and prophets and leaders, and that includes everybody today. And that everything needs to go back to Torah. The fourth thing that we looked at were the new moon verses, and we went through these very, very carefully and in great detail. And every one of these 20 new moon verses in the scriptures are in non-Torah references, and every single one of them has mistranslated Chodesh using the word moon instead of month. There was not one verse that aligned with Torah instructions. And we have decided that it has to come back to Torah. We're still in a review. Last week we looked at the 1611 King James translators to see what was up with them and their treatment of the 2320 Chodesh. And we found that basically they had mistranslated every single new moon scripture, and especially there's about 11 or 12 that have a bundle of, it says new moons, feasts or festivals, and Sabbaths. And in those bundles, they always put new moon instead of new month. But they forgot about Isaiah 47:13. And we found that they made a deliberate mistake to translate the 20 Chodesh verses with new moon. That was deliberate, but they didn't do it for Isaiah 47:13. So we caught them red-handed. That's your red flag verse. You'll want to look at that study. We also looked at 10 different Bible translations with this Isaiah 47:13 to see if they were actually giving us a clue into what that scripture actually said. And we found that they actually said it a lot clearer than the King James Version. Then we actually peeked at some Bible commentators. This is something we normally don't do. We do our work from the scriptures first. But when we looked at 3 popular Bible commentators for their insight into the proper meaning and the history of Isaiah 47:13, they also said that the order of the Hebrew would have been preserved with a little bit different writing, which wasn't chosen the best with the 1611 translators. So obviously they were covering something up. Now, this is where we're going to start with our new part tonight. We're going to be mapping the topics for Tanakh history. We will start with Adam and want to Noah. Oh, there's going to be quite a bit of review going through these because I know it's new material. And then we will do an Old Testament history after we get past Joshua. But we want to take care of Adam all the way up to Noah to see if any of these patriarchs were involved in the worship of no gods. That's what we're looking for. I just hear somebody's mic is open. If those people could please close their mics off for the benefit of everybody else. Thank you. Then we're going to go on and look at some history between the flood up to Nimrod. This is about 700 years of time between the flood and Nimrod. Nimrod was worshipped as a no god. And the question is, did this happen when he was living or only after he died? And does it matter? Next, we're going to look at Terah and no gods. Terah and his family lived in the area of Babylon called Ur of the Chaldees, where no gods were worshipped. Of course, this was the area of Nimrod. We want to find out, was Terah influenced by these no gods? Next, we will look briefly at Egypt and the no gods. They also worshipped many pagan gods, while Yahuah's people were in bondage there. And we want to look at how this affected their experience at Mount Sinai once they got to that 11th campsite. And then we'll look at Joshua and no gods. Now, Joshua is interesting because he trained under Moses, who was the last Melchizedek priest. He had big boots to fill, and his mandate was very clear that he needed to get rid of these idols in the land of Canaan. And what was his very last plea to Yahuah's people before he died? We're going to look at that as well. Then we're going to look at 2 main no gods. There's thousands of no gods worshipped in the world today. However, I believe there are 2 main no gods in the Old Testament that contend for divine worship. Who are they, and which one is top dog? Number 14, we will look at groves and a garden. The groves and high places were specifically designed for the worship of one of the no gods, and we're wondering if there is a link back to the Garden of Eden. We'll take a look at that. Then after we've done all of that, we are going to look at some Old Testament history of Israel between Judges right up to 700 BC. This is near the end of the presentation. There's 113 slides, I believe. This is going to be around slide 90 or something like that, where we have about 8 slides of intense history. So don't get tired yet. But from the heels of Joshua's excellent leadership, Judges then begins to document the serious worship of these no gods. And I just wonder what calendar they happen to be on. And then at the end, we are going to have a slide for some audience participation. So I'd like you to get your questions ready. The slides all have slide numbers. And one thing about this study is that everything is put in order of date so that we can see the picture of what is happening a lot clearer. So we'd like to hear your comments off. So we'll hurry so we can get done before 9 o'clock. I would just like to have a reminder from John the Beloved. This is what he says. And there are also many other things which Yahushua did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written. This is the very last verse in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 25. In my research, I understand that the Gospel of John was the last book written in the Bible. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Revelation were written before the Gospel of John. So it seems to me that this is probably the very last verse that was ever penned in the whole scriptures. Now, why is this so important? Because Yahushua's ministry, well, from his birth till his death, was around 30 years. His ministry was only around, not his ministry, but his life for about 30 years. And John is saying that if everything was written down about Yahushua, that this whole world could not contain the books that would be written about him. Well, the question is this. If every single detail of the Old Testament history for the first 4,000 years before Yahushua came on the scene was written down, how many books would it take? Would it be the Milky Way galaxy? And if it was that many books, how would you or I ever have a chance to get through them and read them to find out what Yahuwah wants us to know? So I've come to the conclusion that every word that is written in the scriptures is of absolute highest importance. The details that are given in our Old Testament history is absolutely crucial to understand because everything is there. It might not be the way you want to see it, but there's a puzzle and we need to learn to put the puzzle together. So there's not one idle word in scripture. So let's remember that as we go through this, because oftentimes I wish that there was a little bit more detail. David says in Psalms 24, verses 3 to 4, who may ascend into the holy hill of Yahuwah, or who may stand in his holy place? And he says, this is who? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to an idol. It doesn't read quite the same in the King James, but he who has not lifted up his soul to an idol. Wonder what that means. And I'm just wondering if this thought could be linked to anything in a calendar study. I'd like you to keep that in mind as we go through the slides tonight. What about the Jews and their moon? Well, most Christians that know anything about the scriptures or anything about Jewish beliefs, they also know that the Jews follow the moon to calculate their biblical month. And because of this, most of them make the assumption that the festal month really is based on the moon. And even people that don't know much about what the Jews believe, most of them know that they look at the moon for the month. Job is a very interesting character, and I consider him a Torah patriarch. He lived at the time of Abraham, and this is what Job tells us in chapter 31. Have I looked at the sun shining in the skies, or the moon walking down its silver pathway, and been secretly enticed in my heart to worship them? If so, I should be punished by the judges, for it would mean that I had denied Yahuwah of heaven. Job is telling us that he knew about this, that if he was to be enticed to look to the sun and the moon and to worship them or to follow them for worship guidelines, that he would come under judgment from Yahuwah of heaven. In fact, he would be punished. That's what Job is telling us. I think Job is a very interesting book. So our question is the moon really in charge of the festal biblical month or not? We've been looking at this now for quite a while. And I'm saying, is there a lunar deception out there? Because most people do watch the moon, whether it's a sliver moon, a conjunction, a full moon. There's all different kinds of teachings out there. Is this a lunar deception? And another question is, or are we dealing with something much more serious than a lunar deception? Could it be that we are dealing with a lunatic authority? We won't answer these questions tonight. This will be on the next lesson in 2 weeks from now, Yahuah willing. But we have lots of questions that need answers for this study. We have questions all over the place, and here's a whole bunch of them. Where did the sun and moon worship really begin? Did this happen somewhere between the generations of Adam to Noah? These are questions I had to ask to figure out what was going on. Do the sun god and the moon goddess represent the major no gods? Or are there other more important pagan gods? If the sun god and the moon goddess are the dominant pagan gods, which one of those two do you think takes #1 position, the sun god or the moon goddess? If sacred regard is given to the sun and the moon for any reason, would that be classed as worship? If the sighting of the sun and the moon are part of the worship calendar, is that action regarded as worship or serving? And will this study be able to conclude which is more deceptive, sun worship or moon worship? We won't get to answer all of these questions tonight, but I want you to keep them in mind as we go through the study today and the next time. Well, Job and the moon, was it a mystery to him? At the time of Abraham, Yahuah's people were known as Hebrews. They were not known as Jews. And Job was living around the time of Abraham. This was long before there were 12 tribes of Israel or any Jews around. And he said he would not be secretly enticed with the moon. No way, no how. And the study today will examine the history. We are going to begin with Adam all the way up to Noah. And like I said, we will then examine the history from Shem, that's Noah's son, up to Abraham. And then we're going to look at the Old Testament history of the northern tribes of Israel. We'll do that today. And then we'll look at the tribe of Judah next time. I want to say right here that this is not an exhaustive study. If it was, you'd probably be here for a couple of weeks, but there is enough tonight that will show you what is happening. And the moon mystery, it will be solved through understanding this history in the Old Testament. The Jews and their moon, are we dealing with a secret there as well? Because remember I said most people today believe the Jews are correct in following certain phases of the moon in connection with their feast and festival worship statutes. Just about everybody knows that the Jews keep special feasts and festivals, and not too many don't know that they don't follow the moon. But those two verses in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and 17 deliver a very strong statute warning against regarding the moon for anything on a worship calendar. And these warnings are deliberately ignored by Judaism today. And here's my question. Is it not a great wonder why their moon is not even questioned by astute scriptural students? Nobody questions them. I think most of us are taught that the Jews were the keepers of the holy oracles, and they ought to know. They know what the truth is, and so just follow them. That's what I was taught. So this secret is going to be solved through understanding exactly what happened after the flood. That's from Shem to Abraham. And when the worship of these other gods actually became a strong practice among the pagans, we want to know where this started. We need to understand the history of Terah and his family as they were coming out of Ur of the Chaldees and how they were affected by pagan gods. I didn't know that they were affected until I had done this study. We also need to understand that we must follow the examples of Job and Abraham. We need to understand exactly what Moses taught through Torah about worshiping the created rather than the creator. And we need to understand the history of both the northern tribes of Israel before they were scattered. We're going to do that today in part 1. And then we need to know the history of Judah from that point onward, and that will be the second part. And what gods were the 12 tribes mesmerized by? And the other question is, what tribe has never let go of their no gods? Maybe you know the answers to these questions already. Yes, we will be picking on the moon in this study, but we aren't going to answer all the questions. Out of all the no gods, I want you just to think about this as we go through the study tonight. What gods take supremacy? And these are the choices. Would the sun god and the moon goddess be two supreme gods? And if they are, out of these two, which of these pagan gods would earn first place? And I hope I haven't given you the answer yet. I want you to figure it out. We will figure that out for sure in the next study. Well, let's go back to the garden. Adam, Eve, and the serpent. We know that Satan was fallen as Lucifer, and he posed as one that knew more than the Creator. He wanted worship. That was his highest goal. And posing as a higher God, he was going to usurp worship if that was the last thing he was going to do. So I'm saying that that serpent was the very first of every no God. Assuming the two most popular choices of no gods are the sun god and the moon goddess, which one would Satan most likely be representing in the garden? Do you think he'd represent the sun god or the moon goddess? And let's not ever forget Romans 1:25, where Paul tells us that there was somebody that changed the truth of Yahuah into a lie and enticed people to worship and serve the creature more than the Creator. Let's always look to the Creator. So here we go with our history from Adam to Messiah. And like I said, we're going to keep the events in order of date because that's one of the things that breaks open this study. Between patriarchs, prophets, and kings of Yahuah, I just have a very simple chart here. This is not including everybody, but some of the main ones, where we start with Adam at creation. Right here, about 130 years later, Enoch comes along. He is of the seed of Cain. He is the second from Adam. But we know that the seed of Cain was not the promised seed, and this Enoch is also not the promised seed. We know that there's Enoch calendars out there that are teaching a lot of things very, very close to Yahuah's covenant calendar, and I'm here to tell you tonight that I believe that the Enoch calendar is the closest counterfeit out there right now. I am not going to delve into the Enoch calendar tonight. That will be coming up a little bit later on. But after that, we do have another Enoch. This is the seventh from Adam, and this is the Enoch that was translated. He's a very special man. And these two Enochs are not the same in any way, shape, or form. After Enoch, we have Methuselah. We all know he was the man that lived the longest on this earth. And the next big event was Noah with the flood. At 2,000 years, we have Abraham, where he receives the covenant. And then we have Moses, another great patriarch, probably the greatest one in the Old Testament, and taking care of the Exodus there and writing down the covenant. And then we have King Solomon at 3,000 years from creation. And at 3,300 years from creation, we have King Hezekiah. These are some of the main ones that I want you to see. These are, we'll see these connections here in just a little bit. But the question is, will the men of Yahuah stay true to their Creator and the covenant calendar that was given to Adam? I absolutely believe that Yahuah would have given Adam the covenant calendar. He would have not just said, figure it out. So next, we want to check out some of these genealogies and see if there was a reliable line of communication between generations. Now, When I've read the genealogies in the scriptures, I used to skip them, but I don't anymore because I'm finding that they have a lot of information there. So first of all, we're going to do some really great men from 4000 BC to 2000 BC, basically Adam, and I absolutely believe that he would have taught the generations after him about the creation calendar because they were admonished to worship Yahuwah that created the heaven and the earth. And this would have been 8 generations up to Noah, and then Noah was asked to carry the truth after that. And Adam was about 600 to 900 years old when Enoch, the 7th in his line, came along the scene, and this Enoch was translated, as we know, covenant calendar. And then Noah, this great man of truth, handed down from Adam to the next 10 generations, including Abraham. We're going to look at some charts. This is the first one. We'll start with Adam, which was actually called the son of Yahuwah. And like I said, he had the privilege and the responsibility to instruct 8 generations after him, all the way up to Lamech, who was the father of Noah. This is for almost 1,000 years. And I'm quite sure that he would have honored and taught and preserved Yahuwah's covenant calendar. Lots of people that have the Hallelujah Bible, I think, or the scriptures, you will have this chart in the back with your maps. Very interesting chart. So there's 8 generations. You can count them out. We have this chart quite a few times. Enoch is the one that walked with Yahuwah, and then he was not, for Yahuwah took him. Enoch would have easily known Adam all his life, being instructed in Yahuwah's covenant, including the divine calendar. I'm just sure that Adam made sure everybody knew what was the deal on who to worship and how. But this Enoch never met death on earth. And the question is, do you think that he would have been translated if he was living in disobedience to the covenant calendar? Never mind anything else. But our subject tonight is covenant calendar. Do you think Enoch would have been translated if he was living in disobedience to the covenant calendar? And then we have Methuselah. Well, Enoch walked with Yahuwah, and after that he begat Methuselah at 300 years of age. Methuselah is a very interesting character on this genealogy chart. He's the connecting link. He lived 669 years after his father was translated. He was a witness to 11 generations, more than anyone in the whole world. Being instructed for 300 years by Enoch, with the covenant truths confirmed in Adam and all of the previous generations, Methuselah is an invaluable link by preserving every truth for future generations. So now let's just look at this. He's got all these generations before him, from Adam, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He's the 8th one. And then he connects up to Shem. That's through Lamech, and Noah to Shem. And then Noah connects to Abraham. He's still living when Abraham is around 50 or 60 years old. So you can see how Methuselah here is the connecting link between Adam to Abraham. It's a very interesting character. Then we have Noah. And this is what it says about Noah. He found grace in the eyes of Yahuwah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with Yahuwah, and Noah did according unto all that Yahuwah commanded him. And 2 Peter tells us that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Noah was able to have instruction from 6 generations before him that knew Adam and learned from his lips. Noah, as the great connecting link, he would have handed down these instructions to the following 10 generations, all the way to Abraham. And I'm just sure that when he documented the flood account, that it was put there for a reason, and that he was on Yahuwah's calendar. This is a very interesting link from Adam down to Noah, down to Abraham. I have this chart here. I'm not going to go through everything on it, but it'll be here for your review. Some dates of biblical events from creation at the beginning, and it's the time frame, and how far from creation all the way down. And in the end, it shows you that the flood started when Noah was 600 years old, and Noah lived another 350 years after that. up to 1656. And Noah is the one that establishes the month length of the covenant calendar in the flood account, and the Torah proves from the flood to Mount Sinai, the creation months were 30 days per month for the first 1,656 years at least. Well, if you're going up to Mount Sinai, you're going to be at 2,500 years. So this is a lot of history right there in the first two books of Scripture. The Genesis account reads like this in Genesis 7 and Genesis 8. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And then it says, and the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. And in chapter 8 it says, the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month of the 17th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat. So let's do the math. And Tim's going to be here to help us if we need some help. We're looking at 30 days per month. We need to start in the second month and the 16th day, because the count begins at the 17th day. When you add 150 days, we will come up with the 7th month to the 16th day, and the very next day, which would be the 151st day, the ark came to rest in the 7th month and the 17th day. This is one of those slides where you have to learn to count. It's slide number 28 if we need to come back to it with questions. Sometimes it's tricky to do the counting and to understand the math, believe it or not. So let's look at some men from 2000 BC up to 1000 BC. Starting here with Noah, we're going to skip over to Abraham. And we know that Seth, for 150 years, would have lived at the same time of Abraham, and that Seth would have preserved those calendar teachings from Noah. And then we can ask the question, do you think that Abraham would have learned the Torah truths of Adam as given to Noah? And what about the truth of the covenant calendar? Would these have been preserved? What about Moses, who lived 120 years? He was the first man to record Yahuah's covenant in a book. He documents an awful lot of information about the covenant calendar in the book of Exodus from chapters 3 to 20. What about Solomon at 1,000 years BC? Well, he started out ruling according to the commandments given by Moses, but did he stick with it? So let's look at Abraham, who obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws, is what the scriptures read. Just notice the interesting connection that Abraham is going to have all the way back to Adam for around 2,200 years. Abraham was given the promise that his seed would be delivered from bondage in 430 years. And I'm just doing some about numbers here. All of the dates and whatnot are average or just estimates. But Noah knows Abraham for about 50 to 75 years. That is awesome. Maybe they didn't live next door to each other, but I'm sure they had contact. And Shem actually outlives Abraham, and he knows Isaac about 110 years, and Jacob about 50 years. Remember, Isaac lived for 180 years. But Shem outlived Abraham. Very interesting how these truths were preserved right down from Adam to Methuselah to Noah and to Shem, so that they could pass it on to the generations afterwards. Then Moses, it says, there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom Yahuah knew face to face. And never ever forget that the book of the covenant was written by Moses, and then it was rewritten.
Join the meeting.
His finger on those stone tablets, front and back. Moses was the chosen Melchizedek to deliver Abraham's seed from bondage around 1491 BC. And the generations that have faithfully handed down Yahuah's covenant orally have all faded off the scene by now. And in chapters of Exodus 19 to 24, Moses is instructed to record Yahuwah's spoken covenant from Mount Sinai in a book that was blood ratified. That's your Melchizedek blood ratified book. And this is already over 2,500 years after creation. So this full covenant also included the proper calculations for Yahuwah's calendar. And you can find that in chapters 3 to 20 of Exodus. And we have studies for that as well. So the covenant calendar has been preserved with these great patriarchs of Yahuwah. I just know that Adam, as the son of our creator, would have taught the creation covenant calendar with 30 days per month. It had 12 months in a year, and this was to honor Yahuwah at his appointed worship times. And Enoch, that was from the line of Seth, he was such a righteous man that he was translated, and I just know for his 305 years that he would have taught Yahuwah's covenant calendar as it was handed down from Adam over 600 years by this time. He would not have made a mistake. Noah, for the first 2,000 years from creation, Noah accurately recorded the covenant calendar through the flood account. And guess what? The month still had 30 days per month, and he does not record that the year changed from 360 days per year. And then we have Abraham. Noah could have known Abraham for at least 50 to 75 years, and Shem outlived Abraham's 175 years. So do you think that Noah or Shem would have deviated from Adam's Torah truths about the covenant calendar and taught them incorrectly to Abraham? I don't think so. Let's just jump up to Joseph right now. In Psalms 81, 3-5, says, "Blow up the trumpet in the new month, in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel and a law of the Elohim of Jacob. For he ordained in Joseph for a testimony when he went out through the land of Egypt." Joseph was the one that preserved this calendar until Moses came on the scene. This is around 1700 BC. We're covering a lot of years from the creation of the earth. Moses was the first patriarch to record Yahuwah's covenant calendar in a Torah. We're still finishing up on a review. And up until that time, information was handed down orally from Adam onward. There was nothing written in a book. And when there was a chance of anything getting lost, then things were written down. So Yahuwah's covenant calendar, I believe, was completely kept and preserved from Passover to Mount Sinai in 1491, just the way it was kept right back at the beginning. The old paths, all of them were preserved by the patriarchs and the prophets for at least 2,550 years. There was no problem about what Yahuwah's calendar was expecting for worship purposes. So how in the world did these no gods enter the picture with their own calendar of worship? That is what we're looking at tonight. So from Adam to Noah, worship of these other gods? No. I couldn't find a single thing. I looked, I read the scriptures, I went, where did these no gods come onto the picture? Because Adam had the privilege and he had the responsibility to instruct 8 generations after him, right up to Lamech, for almost 1,000 years. And I do believe that Adam would have cautioned as many as possible to stay away from pagan gods. When you look at all of these generations from Adam to Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noah, not one of them has a record that they worshipped other gods. But there is a thought to ponder. You can read it from Genesis chapters 1 to 6 of these righteous patriarchs serving other gods. Because when Yahuwah's people make a mistake and they do something they're not supposed to do, it gets recorded, but there is nothing recorded. So my question was, where did the worship of these other gods begin? It certainly wasn't with these first 10 generations. Well, there were no gods before the flood. And today there are thousands of no gods, but this wasn't always the case, because before the flood, many now believe that pagan gods were first actually mortal men, but they were born, they waged war, they had children, and then they died, and it was after they died that they would become deified as gods by their descendants. And that is not a wild speculation. On the contrary, that is a position taken by nearly all historians of antiquity, including Isaac Newton, Augustine of Hippo, Eusebius, Justus Martyr, Josephus, and many others. Though they weren't gods to start with, it was commonly believed that if a man was good enough, he would become a god too. And this carried on down to the Roman Caesars, including the Roman pontiffs today, who say they sit as God in the temple as God, ruling as God. That's from 2 Thessalonians 2, isn't it? So the mythologies were real stories about real men, and they were embellished as gods in their afterlife. It wasn't when they were living. That's not how it started out. And humans were worshipped as pagan gods as well. Augustine writes around 400 AD, those deities who are reckoned gods of the higher orders have gone from us into heaven. Ask those sepulchres that are pointed out in Greece. So to simplify it, he's saying that the pagan gods of the higher order were simply men, and their graves are in Greece. They started life as men, and they were deified and all dressed up by those who survived them after they died. This was a pagan practice that was common enough to be captured in the pages of history, right here in Acts 12, verses 21 to 23. This is what you'll read. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robes, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. And this is what they shouted. This is the voice of a god, not of a man. And immediately, because Herod did not give praise to Yahuah, an angel of Elohim struck him down, and he was eaten by worms, and he died. But Herod was not a follower of Yahuah, and he was deified as a god when he was alive. However, it's very, very interesting that Hebrew heroes were never deified as gods. That's something to think about too. Okay, let's look at Genesis chapter 7 to 9. This is around 2350 BC, after the flood. There were only 8 people that were saved at that time, and Noah's families grew, and they became dispersed and estranged from one another in the land of Ur of the Chaldees. Ham was the youngest of the 3 sons. It was Japheth, Shem, and then Ham. And when he and his men turned away from their supposed wisdom, from the true knowledge of their Creator, the inevitable result was idolatry and heathenism, and that was changing the glory of Yahuah into images like man, birds, beasts, and creeping things, exactly what Romans 1:23 said not to do. So in this map, you can see where Ham actually settled. It's the green areas right here. But they all kind of started out from around the Euphrates River. You can see that Shinar there is part of Ham. He actually went down into the land of Canaan. This is where you're going to find right here in this small print. You'll see the all the ites, the Canaanites, Amorites, Hivites, Hittites, all in there, all through here, this northern part of Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, and here in this Sinai Peninsula, down along here on the Arabian side, and a little bit down here in this corner of Arabia. So you can see where Ham settled, especially around the Sinai area, that there would have definitely been some pagan worship going on there. So what Yahuah needed to do was separate a people away from this group of people of Ham, so that his next generation could be worshiping him and not following these heathen demands. Shem's choices preserved the pure knowledge and the worship of Yahuah right down to his descendants of Terah and the sons Haran and Abraham and Nahor. So now you see that Shem is in this area, okay, all in this area here, including over to Babylon and Ur of the Chaldees, and Japheth actually went up into Asia, over into this area. But Shem is the one here where the truths of the Torah came down through Shem. Japheth was the oldest, but it came down through the second, which is usually what we see in the scriptures. So that's just kind of an interesting picture of where these three boys landed up. In Genesis 10, around 2250, it says that Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahuah. When Nimrod died, he was the first human that became deified as the sun god and eventually named Baal. But did you notice it was when he died, not when he was alive? His wife Semiramis became the moon goddess. She was also named Asherah, and Tammuz was the illegitimate son that eventually became the false Messiah. And right there you have your three main false deities of the scriptures. That's your pagan trinity. There were many new languages that were confused at the construction on the Tower of Babel. Therefore, the sun god, the moon goddess, and Tammuz were given many new names with each culture. Probably a lot of you know this already, but it all started right there with Nimrod in Babylon. The entire earth is now lying in the power of ancient Babylon and the spell cast by these religious ideas that originally started with Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. That was the beginning of these no gods. So Nimrod's secret identity, he was the greatest conspiracy on the earth, including astrology, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Mithraism, Christianity, even Islam. He was the first sun deity, and it started all with the worship of the host of heaven, looking to the sun, the moon, and the stars. But the scriptures forbid worship of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And definitely the scriptures do not support a pagan trinity. And the scriptures do not report giving sacred regard to the sun, the moon, and the stars either. The Tower of Babel was approximately 700 years after the flood, and that was only the beginning of what we find coming up with covenant calendar. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a look at the names of these no gods and the scriptural history of the pagan gods and how it all begins with Nimrod, who was the sun god. And you can always look at these again later. We're just going to press through. But what I wanted to show you was amongst the Israelites, their sun god was named Baal. Instead of Semiramis, they named their queen of heaven or their moon goddess Asherah, and the sun was Tammuz. That came down from Babylon. In Babylon, Nimrod was named Bel or Belus, and then you see Ishtar, that's the more popular name for Semiramis, and Tammuz, of course, stays the same. Of course, Assyria, Greece, and Rome, and the Phoenicians all had their three gods, their false trinity with their particular names. But in Egypt, the sun god was Ra, and the moon goddess was Isis, similar to Ishtar. And then we have the false messiahs, Osiris and Horus. You can find this all over. It's abundant in the history. If we move up to Genesis 11, we're about 1,925 years BC. We're going to look at Terah's family. Even though the family of Shem taught Terah had a knowledge of the proper worship of Yahuah, their worship was also corrupted by idolatry, and they were serving other gods in Ur of the Chaldees. Genesis 1:31, it says, Terah took Abraham, Lot, and Sarai, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees. But if you look at what Joshua has to say, and we'll be looking at Joshua quite a few times through this lesson tonight, don't forget these verses in Joshua 24. He said unto the people, Thus saith Yahuah, your Elohim of Israel, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time. This is over by the Euphrates. Even Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Joshua is saying that Terah served other gods. And this is a relief here of some of the other gods of Ur of the Chaldees. In Genesis 11:31, and Terah took Abraham his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came into Haran and dwelt there. And this is at the time when Yahuah knew that he needed to separate out a people from this Babylonian pagan culture for himself that would not serve other gods. He knew if he left them there, he would not have a people serving him. So they started out from Ur, and they traveled up along these rivers all the way up to Haran, and that's where they settled. Haran was a leading settlement with a temple that was dedicated to moon worship, a huge temple dedicated to moon worship. But Abraham was called out of Haran to go down into Canaan, and Shechem is a major, major spot in this journey. He was counted as being righteous, and he was faithful, and I do not believe that Abraham ever turned to pagan worship. I believe that is why he was called out. But Terah remains in Haran. This is before Abraham left. Terah didn't decide that he was going to go down to Canaan. He just thought, you know what, this is Canaan for me. I got out of Ur. This is good enough. And he didn't make the choice to go any further. Terah in the Hebrew word numbering system is 8646. Terah. He had a family business of manufacturing idols. We're going to see how this comes about. The main no gods of Ur, again, were the sun god and the moon goddess. That's not really a surprise. So what kind of gods may Terah have been involved with? Well, Joshua 24 declared that Terah and his family did serve other gods, and out of Ur, this would have been gods fashioned after Nimrod and Semiramis. Those were the first two main gods. But I do want you to remember that Abraham left for Canaan and Laban didn't. Laban is a grandson, great-grandson of Terah. Laban didn't come down to Canaan. Abraham searches out Canaan in Genesis 12, verses 1 to 4. It was in Haran, and it was at Terah's death that Abraham received the divine call to continue down to Canaan. And the question that I had was Abraham an idolater before his call to go down to Canaan? Although Abraham was not entirely free from the influence of idolatry in his father's house, there is no indication in the scriptures that idol worship was a part of his life. In fact, it says in Genesis 26:5, Abraham obeyed my voice. He kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. There is not one thing written about Abraham where he ran after pagan gods. And I do believe that this is the reason why Abraham was called out to Canaan. And of course, he took Lot with him. But what about the rest of Terah's family? Nahor and his family. What happened up there in Haran? Well, let's look at Nahor and Laban, because they stayed in Haran. Laban was born about 1890 BC. Images and idols were still in Terah's family 200 years later. And around 1740 BC, this is about 50 years later, we have a record in Genesis 31:19 that Rachel stole Laban's images. I'm sure you all remember that, and she was sitting on them. So I went and looked up the word images in the concordance. It's 8655, and it says teraphim, and then it says a family idol. Oh, okay. So I think it was time then, after I saw that, to make a connection between teraphim, images, and great-grandfather Terah. So you can see here, Terah is the father of Abraham, of Nahor, and of Haran. He happened to die in Lot, but Nahor and Abraham came down. Nahor then begat Bethuel, and Bethuel has Laban. So this is grandfather, great-grandfather. Here's some commentary for Terah and teraphim on this Genesis 31:20 25 passage, why hast thou stolen my gods? And it's plural. It's not my God, it's my gods. From Wycliffe Bible Commentary, he says, here Laban referred to his teraphim. Evidently, Laban was more concerned about losing his images than over losing Jacob's family, and his search failed to discover these little gods. Barnes Notes has something interesting to say on teraphim. He says this word occurs 3 times in this chapter and nowhere else in the Pentateuch. It is always in the plural number. The teraphim were symbols or representatives of the deity, as Laban calls them his gods. They seem to have been busts of the human form, sometimes as large as life. Those of full size were probably of wood, and the smaller ones may have been made of metal. Of course, if they made the huge ones in metal, you could never carry them around. They have been worn on an ephod for the purposes of divination. The employment of them in the worship of God, which Laban seems to have inherited from his fathers, is denounced as idolatry in 1 Samuel, and hence they are classed with the idols and other abominations that were eventually put away by Josiah in 2 Kings. And this is a relief of what maybe some of these gods looked like. So, just wondering which no god gains the authority. Is it going to be the sun god that will gain #1 spot? Or will it be the moon goddess Semiramis? Let's begin by examining Laban a little bit closer and see what we can find. So we need to do a little investigation on this name Laban. In Genesis 31, it says, and Laban said, and yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods, is what Laban said, my gods. Now Rachel had taken the images, and she sat upon them, and Laban searched all the tent, but he did not find them. His gods were really important to him. Let's compare Terah and the images to Laban and the moon god. So Terah is 8646. Teraphim images is 8655. It means family idols. These numbers are very, very close in the Hebrew numbering system. The spelling, the pronunciation, and the word numbers all connect to idols. Terah, teraphim, very close in pronunciation and spelling. 8646 and 8655 are very close in Hebrew numberings. Then we have Laban, who is 3837. Let's look at what Labana is, which is the color of the moon, whiteness. It's 3842. Very, very close here. Again, we have spelling, pronunciation, and word numbers that are very close, and these are all connecting to the moon. There's a very strong indication now that Terah did have an occupation in Haran of making moon idols for distribution. It would not have been sun. This is connecting to the moon. Remember that Terah came out of Ur, which was the first center for major idol worship, and Haran was also a moon worshiping center. No, there isn't any scripture that states it just like that in black and white, but the connection can be proven through the name Terah and the teraphim family idols that were in Laban's possession nearly 200 years later, only to be coveted and stolen by Rachel. It was the coveted inheritance of the family. Terah's business of manufacturing idols would have been passed down through the generation, thus a line of precious family idols. Everybody wanted them, and everything is pointing back to these family idols as being connected to moon worship through Laban and Labana. They were moon idols linked to Semiramis in Babylon. Very interesting. Let's take just a really quick look at Egypt and moon worship. Abraham was told that his descendants would be in bondage to Egypt and they would not return to Canaan for at least 430 years. Well, down in Egypt, they had Ra as their sun god, and Isis was their moon goddess. And it's very likely that these two major gods were a snare to Yahuwah's people while they were in bondage there, and maybe not able to worship the way that they wanted to. And of course, they might have lost a lot of their truths. But Egypt's sun god Ra was challenged by the 10th plague of Egypt, resulting in the death of the firstborn of every family. And if it wouldn't have been for Passover, all of the firstborn would have died if they were not under the blood, but they were all delivered from this death. There were 42 campsites on their journey to Canaan once they left Egypt. And what we're going to do right now is just look at campsite 11 for a little tiny bit. See what we can find. This is around 1490 BC. Mount Sinai is the 11th campsite, and number 11 connects to negative concepts of reproof, warning, and disorder. The root word for Sinai actually means tares, thorns, and demons in the negative form. In the Syriac language, Sinai means to shine, as the moon, which was an object of worship in that area. Remember that map? This was the area where Ham had some of his family. This campsite, found in an area of moon worship, is the very place where the enemy planned to again exalt his throne over Yahuwah's. In fact, it was only 40 days after the everlasting covenant was spoken that Yahuwah's people had broken their covenant agreement, and they were found dancing before the image of the Egyptian false trinity. This action was clearly a case of blasphemously mixing worship intended for Yahuwah as well as being mixed with idolatry. And if there's something that Yahuwah doesn't like, it's mixing the holy with the profane. The 11th campsite was all about a false trinity. In Exodus 32, it's recorded that Aaron had made a molten calf, and they said, "These be thy gods," it's plural, "these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt." And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. The golden calf was not a single entity. It was not just one god. There were three gods represented in Aaron's design at the base of Mount Sinai. The physical altar site is still standing at the base of Jabal el-Laz, along with photos of what the Egyptian calf god most accurately looked like. We're going to take a look at this. This is Egypt's unholy trinity. In this picture right here, you see two gods in one. The golden Egyptian calf god does not depict just a single god. Why? Because this solar disk right up here represents the serpent sun god as the father of the calf god shown on the head of the golden calf. So there you have Nimrod represented there, and the actual calf god as Tammuz. The third deity is the female component. It is not part of the golden calf itself, but rather it was part of the altar base. And upon the stones are petroglyphs depicting this Egyptian god. You can find this if you get to go over there and look. That would sure be interesting. These deities were also known as the sun god, with the moon goddess being his wife, and of course the sun was the false messiah. Information is all over the internet. But look what is still standing 3,470 years or more later. It's the altar representing the moon goddess. Tammuz and Nimrod are gone, but the altar is still there. That's a hint, everybody, about which god takes priority. Moses gives very strict commands in Deuteronomy 4:15-19 and chapter 17, verses 2-5. I'm just going to summarize it here. He says, "If there be any found among you that corrupt yourselves by lifting your eyes unto heaven, seeing the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the host of heaven, if then you are driven to worship them and serve them or give them sacred regard for any reason, that person shall be stoned until they die. There was a death penalty. For he says, Yahuwah has commanded that none should serve or give sacred regard to other gods represented by the sun, the moon, and the stars. Moses told the people not to follow these pagan gods, but he also said that after he dies, guess what? That is exactly what they're going to do. And we all know that that's what they did. Yes, the pagans began their days with looking to the sun. They still do today. The pagans also began their months by looking to the moon. But that is not the case with Yahuwah's calendar, because his calendar commencements do not follow the ways of the pagans, not then and not today. And his calendar does not look to the sun to start the day, it does not look to the moon to calculate the month for any of his worship statutes. Therefore, there is nothing more offensive to Yahuwah than mixing these profane, idolatrous practices with his worship, his sacred worship. In fact, this would be the ultimate blasphemy and an act tantamount to the highest level of spiritual rebellion. In fact, it's called an abomination, and that is a very strong word, an utmost evil. It was these pagan roots that were found at the base of Mount Sinai only 40 days after the people had agreed to Yahuwah's everlasting covenant. And that is something I still have a hard time understanding how they could have done that. But we need to beware of falling into idolatry while we're professing to worship our Creator. Could we be falling into idolatry by observing an incorrect calendar by choice? If you don't know, that's one thing, but if you do know, that's something else. This is a very serious slide, everybody. And I shudder in my boots to even put it on the screen, but I want you to think about what's going to come. What about the calendar and the Christian churches today? Our Sunday Christians, they all honor their day of worship on Sunday, giving homage to the sun god from ages past. Could you agree with that? That's what they say. Then we have Sabbath keepers. Most of them honor the opening of their worship days beginning with the sunset the night before the Sabbath, whether it's a weekly Sabbath or an annual one. And they are paying homage to the sun god from ages past, believe it or not, just like the pagans. Then we have another group of Sabbath keepers and most feast keepers. Not all Sabbath keepers are feast keepers, but this group that honor the feasts as well. In addition to honoring sunset, most also honor the moon for the biblical month start, thus paying homage to the goddess of the moon. And my question is, which of these three groups is the most deceived? Is it the Sunday Christians, or the Sabbath keepers, or those that are Sabbath keepers and feast keepers? Think about that. Let's move up to Joshua because he followed in Moses' footsteps. He was a great leader, and his first campaign before entering the land of Canaan was to destroy Jericho or Jericho. This was a moon-worshipping city. We know that moon and the lunation cycle is Uruk and Yorok. And here's Jericho or Jericho. This is all the same family of words in the Hebrew. So Jericho was a moon-worshipping city. They were not to go any further into Canaan until that city came down, and it was the walls that came down. For 20 years, Joshua fought to rid the land of Canaan of these pagan people and practices. This would have been the leftovers from Noah's third son, Ham. And before he died, he gave them very strict warnings not to run after and serve other gods. And the people promised that they would be obedient. But we know that pagan gods were still a problem. About 25 years later, Joshua gives an appeal. He said unto the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen you, Yahuwah, to serve him." And they said, "We are witnesses." And Joshua says, "Now therefore put away," said he, "the strange gods which are among you, and incline your heart unto Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel." So it's very obvious that Israel still had strange gods among them. And he was asking them to make a pledge and to get rid of these gods out of the land. This possibly could be Joshua's pillar at Shechem. Some archaeologists believe that this could be the actual stone that Joshua erected at Shechem to hear and bear witness to Yahuwah's covenant with Israel. It'd sure be nice to see where this covenant was made. I'm going to read this again from Joshua because I think it's really important, and it's coming up further on too. And the people said unto Joshua, Yahuwah our Elohim will we serve, and his voice will we obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and he set them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of Yahuwah, and he took a great stone, and he set it up there under an oak that was by the sanctuary of Yahuwah. And Joshua said unto all the people, Behold, this stone shall be a witness unto us, for it hath heard all the words of Yahuwah, which he spoke unto us. It shall therefore be a witness unto you, lest you deny your Elohim. The stone was a witness. Shechem is a very interesting place. It's a place of decision for Yahuwah for a lot of people. In Genesis 12, Abraham built an altar to Yahuwah at Shechem, and the everlasting covenant was confirmed with him there. In Genesis 33, Jacob's altar was at Shechem when he was coming back with his to have his first dwelling place in Canaan. In Genesis 35, Jacob hides the family idols that Rachel had stolen under the oak tree at Shechem. And in Joshua 24, this is where Joseph's bones were buried in a tomb there at Shechem. And also in Joshua 24, this is where Joshua assembled Israel at Shechem to choose the Elohim that they were planning to serve. It's a very interesting place in the geography. I'm going to read Joshua 24 again, 14 and 15. Now therefore fear Yahuwah, and put away the gods of your fathers that they served on the other side of the flood, and in Egypt. Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahuwah. I find it's very interesting that a lot of us know verse 15, choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve Yahuwah. We just sort of forget about that in-between part there where he's actually telling them, you know, that you've got forefathers that serve these other gods. And it was at Shechem that Joshua wanted to renew this covenant with the people so that he could be sure that they were on the right page. And this was before he died, just before he died. He pleaded with them to get rid of these pagan gods. We need to do some history all the way from the book of Judges to Malachi. We'll get started on that tonight. The history of the apostasy in the Old Testament magnifies considerably after Moses dies, and beginning with Judges is where the scriptures first mention Baal and Asherah. Common terms in the Old Testament, when it says Baal, that's talking about the sun god, or if it says Balaam, it's plural. When you see Asherah, it's the moon goddess. And we're still wondering which one of these pagan gods will be dominant. So you don't hear about these gods until the book of Judges. I want to do some definitions for some of these idols because you'll be coming across this in your reading, and I'll have some of it tonight. But Baal, he was the chief male deity of the Phoenicians and the Canaanites. Asherah was the principal female deity, and the worship of Baal, together with that of Astarte, was common among the Hebrews. Human sacrifices were also offered to Baal by the Jews, Jeremiah 19:5, and that's not the only place you'll find it. It's all over the Old Testament. Then we have Asherah or Ashtaroth. There's many different spellings and pronunciations. This was a Syrian goddess idol whose worship was very ancient, and it was common among the Israelites. She is generally mentioned in connection with Baal and is commonly identified with Astarte, the goddess of the moon. And when you see Queen of Heaven, that was the moon being called the Queen of Heaven. And there are 3 rebukes from Jeremiah to Judah for this abomination. The Queen of Heaven, making the case. Groves is another important term to know. This was basically tree images that were used for worship of the goddess Asherah. These groves were forbidden by Yahuah. They were never to be established for worship for him or for anybody else. And there's 11 references in the Old Testament where it tells you about Israel's worship in the groves. Here's one, Isaiah 40:20. He that is so impoverished that he hath no oblation chooseth a tree that will not rot. He seeketh unto him a cunning workman to prepare a graven image that shall not be moved. And in 2 Kings 17:16 it says, and they left all the commandments of Yahuah their Elohim, and they made them molten images, even 2 calves, and they made a grove, and they worshipped all the host of heaven, and they served Baal. Those references are all over the Old Testament. High places is another term that is used to describe the places of worship for Yahuah in groves. There are 13 places in the Old Testament that call it idolatrous worship. Call it groves, and 19 that say idolatrous worship, 9 of those. And there's 5 in the Old Testament that say idolatrous high places to be destroyed. It's all over the place. Another god is Chun. This is an idol that was made and worshipped by the Israelites in the wilderness. And then we have Moloch or Milcom. 3 different names, all the same. This is an idol of the Amorites, was worshipped by Solomon and his wives, and Israel sacrificed their children to Moloch's molten arms. There are 12 instances in the Old Testament about offering children, live children. In Jeremiah 7:31, Yahuah says, and they have built the high places of Tophet to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. Yahuah never intended for his people to be putting their children in the fire. Yet that's what they were doing. We're not going to go through all of these. I did a search through the scriptures for other names of pagan gods. I found 30 of them. Some of them you might not recognize, but if you come across these when you're reading, you'll just notice that there was an awful lot of different gods. But some of my search, Anamelech was a moon god, Adramelech was a sun god. Some of these, Ashima, you'd have to do your study on them, but Asherah is a very popular one. This is a moon goddess. These ones in pink are all moon goddesses. Baal, of course, is the sun god. Lots of Baal Berith, Baal Peor, Baal Zebub, Baal Zebon, probably remember these. Baal was a sun god. Dagon, you all remember that one, was a sun god. There's Chun in Chemosh. Diana was a moon goddess. Then you have that golden calf, which was the Trinity. Of course, Jupiter and Mercury, I think those were from Rome. You have Moloch or Milcom, Merodach. All of these are gods. You come down here to the Queen of Heaven. That was definitely a moon god. Tammuz was also a sun god. He was just the false messiah. Lots of different gods in the Old Testament. Why? Because Israel was following after them. But I want you to look at one more definition, and that's for Haran. This was a city of the main trade routes between Babylonia and the Mediterranean Sea. And like the Chaldeans, Haran's inhabitants worshipped Sin, which was the moon god from very ancient times. It was a natural stopping place for Terah to settle on his departure from Ur. And the cult of moon worship persisted far into the Christian era after the 4th century AD. That is how strong the moon worship was in Haran, way up to the 4th century AD. There is also an abundance of pagan worship. When I researched this, I just was looking for everything that I could find. I want to take some time on this slide because you might want to do your research as well. This is the number of times in the Old Testament that I found references, and this was the phrase. So 140 times I found the phrase image or images. 46 times I found graven images. 23 times molten images. 5 times carved images, if my counting is right on all of these. I found 2 for images of Baal, 95 for idols, 62 for Baal, 18 for Balaam. There was 5 for Queen of Heaven and Asherah, 3 as the moon goddess, 10 for Moloch or Chun, 41 references for groves. That represents moon worship. Look at this, everyone. 80 references for high places that were used for moon worship. 3 that were high places of Baal, 2 that say priest of Baal. There was 4 that say sun, moon, and host of heaven. 14 that single out just the host of heaven. There was 220 references, if I counted right, that talked about pagan gods. 6 for no gods. 10 for thy gods. This is talking about pagan gods, and 34 for their gods, which is also pagan gods. 52 for altars. There was 12 references about burning their children in the fire. Altogether, it's around 887 references to pagan worship practices. I just did a little bit of math. For the listed phrases, there are at least 887 Old Testament references linking to pagan worship. In the Old Testament history books, just the Old Testament history books, not Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Solomon, things like that, but 549 chapters in Old Testament history books. If you just do the math, you have an average mention of apostasy of these pagan worship practices about 15 times in every 10 chapters. It's all over the place. What are the snares of these no gods? Obviously, there's something going on because the Old Testament is just filled with what was happening. Right from the Garden of Eden, where another god was honored, the whole Old Testament history is tainted with roots that link to paganism. Israel and all the pagan nations worshipped many, many gods, but was every pagan god a snare to Israel, or was something else going on in the background? Sometimes you have to wonder. And there was snares for Baal and Asherah. This study is going to show that there were many times that Israel and Judah fell back into apostasy. They would come out and they would always fall back. And the main gods that were a snare to Israel that keep coming to the forefront are always the sun god, which is Baal, and the moon goddess, which is Asherah. And right from Mount Sinai, these are the first 2 gods that Moses instructed the people that they were not to worship them. In fact, he commanded the people to not even think about looking to the sun or the moon, as they would soon be enticed to worship these creations like the pagans do. In fact, he said, do not lift up your eyes. And the word lift is 5375. Nasa, basically means to exalt, to hold up, to magnify, or to respect. Do not lift up your eyes. But the word worship should have some clarity. Could it be classed as sacred regard? You know, Moses was right, and it's going to become clear very quickly and very obviously that Israel and Judah were both inflicted with this terrible, ungodly desire to seek other gods, even after they were delivered so mightily by Yahuah from from Egypt, and from Babylon. And unfortunately today, most feast keepers persistently gaze at the leadership of the moon for timing their lunar-based worship calendar. This exposes their relentless cohesion to the purposely mistranslated texts of non-Torah origin. And that foundation of the lunar-based calendar is extracted straight out of Babylonian paganism. sacred worship, sacred regard. We should look at the word appreciation and see what clarity it needs to have, because there's nothing wrong or evil about taking the time to admire and to appreciate any of Yahuwah's creation that is given to bless the earth and mankind. In fact, all creation is the work of his mighty hand, and a visual look at the moon is not evil. Just remember what Romans 1:25, it's a reminder that tells us to worship and serve the Creator, not the Creator. And how many times have we seen a full moon rising, even the harvest moon? It is absolutely gorgeous. And it sure is nice to have it at night if you're traveling on the highway. It's beautiful creation. Job provides his clarity. We're going to do this verse again from the beginning, because Job said, have I ever looked at the sun or the moon, and if I've been secretly enticed to worship them? If so, I should be punished by the judges, for it would mean that I had denied Yahuwah in heaven. Job is talking about this kind of looking. He is not talking about this kind of amazement. He's talking about looking to the lights in the sky for worship calendar purposes. Well, who is Baal? Do we really know? He was the most significant male deity of the Canaanites, along with his companion Asherah, and they were the most alluring deities confronting Israel in the Promised Land. There's abundant references to Baal in the Old Testament, and it indicates his attractiveness and influence on the Israelites. They were completely taken in with Baal. The book of Judges chronicles the numerous times that Yahuwah's people fell to the temptation of Baal worship. And then along comes King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and it was Jezebel that made Baal worship the royal religion of the northern kingdom, with a Baal temple in Samaria. She was a pagan priestess. And Baal, like Asherah, was also worshipped at high places, which is known as the groves, and he did require child sacrifices. That's who Baal was. Just a few reliefs to look at, and there's a lot out there that is being found about the sun god Baal, or Tammuz, Ra, Horus, who were worshipped in ancient times. You can usually see them depicted with one eye, the all-seeing eye. Wonder what that links to. And then Mitra with his halo, or this nimbus. You see that in a lot of reliefs as well, this halo or nimbus. And if you look at a lot of the Catholic art, all of Jesus, their Mary, all of their saints have that halo. That's completely from paganism. Baal's companion, who is it? You should know by now. Because of Israel's incomplete conquest of the land of Canaan, the roots of Asherah worship from Semiramis survived and plagued Israel, starting just as soon as Joshua died. I couldn't believe it, how short of amount of time it took for them to forget their promise. And considered as the moon goddess, Ashtoreth, or Asherah, was often presented as a partner of Baal, the sun god. But what about the groves of Ashtoreth and Asherah? This moon goddess was represented by a limbless tree, a tree trunk planted in the ground. This trunk was usually carved into a symbolic representation of a goddess, and because of the association with carved trees, the places of Ashtoreth were commonly called groves, or high places. And the Hebrew family words of Asherah, or Asherim, which is plural, they could refer either to the moon goddess or to a grove of trees. It was forbidden Asherah worship. Yahuwah through Moses forbade the worship of Asherah. The law specified that a grove of trees was not to be near the altar of Yahuwah, not ever. And despite those clear instructions, Asherah worship was a perennial problem in Israel. It didn't seem to matter how many times they were told not to go there, they did it anyway. And Solomon, who was supposed to be the wisest man, slipped into idolatry. One of the pagan deities he brought into the kingdom was Asherah, called the goddess of the Sidonians. The Biblical Archaeology Review has this to say: history's vanquished goddess Asherah. The worship of Asherah came to be regarded as much a feature of popular religion in ancient Israel and Judah as the worship of Yahweh. Pretty sad. We should look at some names and symbols of Ashtoreth, because as you go in your study, you'll come across these. Ashtoreth, Asheroth, Asherim, and Atrat. They're all plural forms of the moon goddess name, or a goddess of the woods. There's just all kinds of them. And she's imaged as a full-breasted earth mother. Both symbols speak to regeneration, sustenance, and fruitfulness, and the groves of trees were her temples, and she's often referred to as a tree or a pole. And here's a picture of a modern-day Asherah pole. I found this on the internet. I'm sorry I could not find the place where it is located, but I'm sure there's plenty of them around the world. And guess what, everyone? The maypole is attributed to this goddess. Did you ever have these maypoles in your playground in elementary school? Because we sure did. I just want to have a slide here to look a little bit at these maypoles, because there is a connection to Ashereth. We'll go through it quickly, but I leave the slide up here later for you to look at again. This goddess was the goddess of fertility and sexual lust, known as Ashtaroth or Ashtoreth. And they put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth. That's in 1 Samuel 31:10. Each spring, the pagans would set up phallic poles called Asherahs under trees or high hills and celebrate their fertility festival with unbridled sexual perversion. And this is how the maypole originated. Pretty sad. When the Israelites incorporated this into their worship, God did not commend them for making it easier for the pagans to convert to Judaism. Instead, he was provoked to anger. He said, "This is not the way to bring them into my light. And Jehovah shall strike Israel as the reed waves in the water, and shall pluck up Israel from off this good land that he gave to their fathers. And he shall scatter them beyond the river, because they have made their Asherahs, provoking Jehovah to anger. And Judah did evil in the sight of Jehovah. And they provoked him to jealousy above all their fathers did by their sins that they had sinned. And they built, they also, high places for themselves, and standing pillars and Asherahs on every high hill and under every green tree." It's from 1 Kings 14. And in Exodus 34:13 and Deuteronomy 12:3, the Israelites were commanded to destroy the Asherah poles. And we do find in 2 Kings 23 that King Josiah did carry out the demolition plan. He did get rid of a lot of them. But I don't think there was anybody that just cleaned up the whole land. How is Ashtoreth connected to this moon goddess? Well, first of all, in Babylon, the moon was a god, but after the rise of the solar theology, when the larger number of the Babylonian gods were resolved into forms of the sun god, their wives also became solar, or Ishtar, or the daughter of Sin, the moon god. And then in Canaan, Ashtoreth, as distinguished from the male Ashtar, dropped her warlike attributes and became a moon goddess. They are very closely connected. She's called the Queen of Heaven. In Canaan, Baal passed into a sun god, and the goddess who stood at his side became the representative of the moon, or a pale reflection of the sun. It was around 628 BC that Jeremiah refers to Asherah when he uses the title Queen of Heaven, referring to the moon goddess. And you'll find all kinds of pictures of this moon goddess just everywhere. What about Jezebel and this moon goddess worship? Along with Baal, Jezebel made Asherah worship even more prevalent, with 400 prophets of Asherah on the payroll. And throughout history, Israel and Judah were constantly tempted to worship this pagan goddess and attend her rituals. It was a forbidden practice which finally led to Judah's captivity and the 70 years in Babylon, even though many good kings destroyed the Asherah groves. They just were always enticed to go back. This is just a little slide here of ancient and modern Asherah poles. The first one is from 2000 BC. It's a relief impression from the royal libation cup of King Gudea of Lagash in Sumer. This is around the Babylonian area. This is 2000 BC. Then we move up to the time of Paul with the Temple of Artemis in Ephesia. Paul was in Ephesus preaching the gospel, and he was confronted by this Artemis cult, and these people had no plans to abandon their goddess. So that's 2,000 years between the two. Let's move up another 2,000 years to today. This is a modern Asherah pole. People still pay tribute to the moon goddess. I imagine if you did a study on the totem poles, you're going to come up with the same thing. So stay away from the groves. Yahuah absolutely detested the worship of his people. To visit these tree poles in the high places in the groves, paying tribute to the moon goddess. In Deuteronomy 16:21 and 22, he says, "Thou shalt not plant thee a grove of any trees near unto the altar of Yahuah thy Elohim, neither shalt thou set up thee any images." And in 1 Kings 11:5, this is about 985 BC, around the time of Solomon. It says Solomon went after Asherah, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. Remember, Milcom is where they offered their live children to. Also in verse 33, it says, "They have forsaken me. They have worshipped Asherah, the goddess of the Zidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways to do that which is right in my eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father." That's what Solomon was doing. These groves were an abomination to Yahuah. It makes you wonder why they were doing such things. What about the groves and a garden? Right here, this is the tree pole of Ashtoreth moon worship in this relief. Take a look and compare the Ashtoreth tree pole with the garden tree pole. Did the abomination of worship start here at the tree in the garden? What do you think? It's now time that we review some of the Old Testament records of Israel's sacred regard for these pagan gods and what they stand for. Remember, Baal is Lord, it's their sun god, and the moon goddess is Ashtoreth. They have their groves and their high places, everything for worship is enticing them to pagan worship through and through, day in and day out. Yahuah predicts that Israel's rebellion is going to happen. This is in Deuteronomy 31, approximately 1451 BC. And Yahuah said unto Moses, "Behold, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, and this people will rise up and go a-whoring after the gods of the strangers of the land, whither they go to be among them, and will forsake me, and they will break my covenant which I have made with them." And a few verses later, Moses does foresee Israel's rebellion, and this is what Moses says in verse 27 and 29. "For I know thy rebellion and thy stiff neck. Behold, while I am yet alive with you this day, you have been rebellious against Yahuah, and how much more after my death? For I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves, you will turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of Yahuah, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands, building these idols." Yes, other gods of Israel's. It's talked about in Psalms 81. It says, "Hear, O my people, and I will testify unto thee, O Israel, if thou wilt hearken unto me. There shall no strange god be in thee, neither shalt thou worship any strange god. I am Yahuah thy Elohim, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not hearken to have my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So, Yahuwah said, I gave them up unto their own heart's lusts, and they walked in their own counsels. Yahuwah had no other choice. He gave them up. Joshua's instructions were given in 1425 BC, about 25 years after Moses died. We're going to read these verses again. Now therefore fear Yahuwah and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve Yahuwah. And if it seem evil unto you to serve Yahuwah, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahuwah. And the people answered and said, Yahuwah forbid that we should forsake him to serve other gods. And Yahuwah drove them out before us all. And Yahuwah drove out from before us all the people, even the Amorites which dwelt in the land. Therefore we will also serve Yahuwah, for he is our Elohim. And how long did it last? Forsaking the strange gods, Israel's promise, well, in 1427 BC, if you forsake Yahuwah and serve strange gods, then he's going to turn and do you hurt and consume you. After that he hath done you good. And the people said unto Joshua, Nay, but we will serve Yahuwah. And Joshua said to the people, You are witnesses against yourselves, that you have chosen Yahuwah to serve him. And they said, We are witnesses. Now therefore put away, said he, the strange gods which are among you, and incline your heart unto Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, Yahuwah our Elohim will we serve, and his voice will we obey. Joshua asked a couple times, wasn't just once. And then, about 2 years later, this is what's going to happen. We'll look at these dates in the Old Testament. Start at the book of Judges. I have about 8 slides like this with charts. They have a very brief review of the worship of pagan gods and apostasy in the 12 tribes. And I'd like you to take special note of the dates as we travel through about 700 years of history from 1400 to 700 BC. We're going to start at 1425. Israel didn't drive out the pagans, and they were going to be constantly snared by false gods. In Judges 2, Israel was serving Balaam, the sun god, and most important, Asherah was there too as the moon goddess. This is the first mention of Balaam and Asherah right there in Judges 2, just shortly after Joshua died. Again, the same time frame, Israel would not hearken to judges, but whored after other gods. They were bowing down to them. They were completely entrapped. In 1405, this is Judges chapter 3, they were intermarrying their sons and daughters with pagan nations, and they were serving their Balaam gods. In Judges chapter 5, about 1315 BC, Israel is choosing new strange gods. They weren't to do that either. And in Judges 6, about 1250 BC, Yahuwah is cautioning them to not fear the gods of the Amorites. They were on a course. Remember, 200 years earlier, Moses had given very strict commands to Israel so that the people would be kept free from the worship of pagan gods. And the question is, did Israel have troubles with running after the sun god and the moon gods in the remainder of the history of the Old Testament, or did it just end here at 1250 BC? Let's look and see. We're going to look at Gideon as a judge now. This is in Judges 6. Still 1250 BC. Gideon is now throwing down the Baal altars, or the sun god, and that belonged to his father, but he was getting rid of them. But then in Judges chapter 10, the children of Israel are doing evil again in the sight of Yahuwah. They're serving Balaam and Asherah and the gods of Syria, Zidon, Moab, Ammon, and the Philistines. They have forsaken Yahuwah, and they were not serving him at all. Did evil again in the sight of Yahuwah. So the apostasy seems to have exceeded every former one in grossness and universality of the idolatry practiced. The Hebrews adopted the objects of worship among the several pagan countries bordering the district of Palestine in which they lived. That is exactly what Moses said would happen if they didn't get rid of these people. And some scholars feel that Israel may have actually erected a pantheon. It's hard to believe that Israel became universal idolaters, adopting every god of the surrounding nations. Balaam and Ashtaroth signify gods and goddesses in general, and this is how they're reckoned. The gods of Syria were Bel and Satron, or Jupiter and Astarte. The gods of Zidon were Ashtaroth, Astarte, or Venus. The gods of Moab were Chemosh. The gods of the children of Ammon were Milcom, and the gods of the Philistines, they had Dagon. But Yahuah didn't have a choice. He had to give Israel up so that they could be in bondage to the Philistines and the Ammonites because they were wanting to whore after their gods. He didn't have any choices. We'll look now at Samuel and Saul in this time frame between 1120 to 1055. In Judges 17, Micah, he has a house full of gods. In about 1110 BC, Samuel told Israel to put away their strange gods and Ashtoreths, and they did it for a while under Samuel, but it didn't last very long. In 1095, you can see this is only like 15 years later in Samuel chapter 12, Israel is serving Balaam and Ashtoreth again. In 1 Samuel 28, 1055, this is 40 years later, Saul is now meeting up with the witch of Endor to call up other gods because he's looking for Samuel. That was their leader, King Saul. And what were the consequences for this? He was in battle, he was defeated, he was wounded, and in 1 Samuel 31:5, Saul took his own sword and he fell upon it. That was the end result of following after pagan gods. Solomon. David prayed for Solomon. Solomon follows these great patriarchs. And David prayed, "Give Solomon my son a perfect heart to keep thy commandments, thy testimonies, and thy statutes, and to do all these things." Solomon is king about 3,000 years after Adam. He has the history of all these generations, and he's got all the writings of Moses. And all the kings were instructed to rule their kingdom according to the laws of Moses and Torah. But did Solomon do it? Well, he was called the wisest man, and he diligently made provisions for his military court and other personnel during the 40 years that he reigned. He did some things right. So we're going to examine one scriptural account dating 3,000 years after Adam and how this links to the covenant calendar when he ruled according to the laws of Moses. And the following information of King Solomon's instructions will be in alignment with the covenant calendar. And we've done this before. You'll find this in 1 Chronicles 27. I will read verse 1. "Now the children of Israel, after their number, to wit, the chief fathers and captains of thousands and hundreds and their officers that served the king in any matter of the courses, which came in and went out month by month through all the months of the year, every course there were 20 and 4,000. So every month he had a captain. Solomon had a captain to do the things that needed to be done in his court. And he lists in this chapter the first month, second, third, fourth. And you can see all the way down 5, 6, 7, 8th month, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. He had captains for 1 month of the year every year, but there was no provisions for a 13th month. So at this point in time, Solomon is definitely on covenant calendar with Yahuah. He started out good, he had good intentions, but how long did it last? In 1 Kings 9, about 990 BC, Yahuah is warning Solomon about worshiping these other gods. Then in 1 Kings 11, about 5 years later, it says, "But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom Yahuah had said to the children of Israel, You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. And we know that Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and they all turned his heart after their gods. He definitely went after Asherah, which was the moon goddess of the Sidonians, and definitely after Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. And remember, Milcom, or also Moloch or Moloch, was a bronze statue heated with fire into which the victims were thrown. These were often child sacrifices, living children placed into the molten arms of Moloch. Pretty sad. These other gods of Solomon, it's recorded completely. I'm going to read it because I think we need to have an understanding of this. For Solomon went after Asherah, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of Yahuah, and went not fully after Yahuah, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build a high place, that's a grove, for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for all his strange wives, which burned incense and sacrificed unto their gods. And Yahuah was angry with Solomon, because his heart was turned from the Elohim of Israel, which had appeared unto him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he kept not that which Yahuah commanded, the wisest man in the whole world. Let's look now from 905 to 785 BC. We're going to be looking at Ahab, Athaliah, and Amaziah, all wicked, wicked people. In 905 BC, King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, they have other gods, but they're not any match for Elijah's Elohim. In 885, 20 years later, King Ahab's worshippers of Baal are killed. Sacred pillars in the temple of Baal are burned. We're having a reformation here. And the house of Baal is broken down along with the altars and images. How long is it going to last? 5 years later, King Jehoiada is also breaking down the altars and images, and he killed the priest of Baal, trying to clean up the land. In 2 Chronicles 24, it says, for the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken up the house of Yahuah, and also all the dedicated things of the house of Yahuah did they bestow upon Balaam. 2 Chronicles 25, about 55 years later, King Amaziah set up Edom gods. He worshipped them, and he burned incense to them. Then Amos 5 records in 785 that Yahuah despises their feast days. This is Israel's feast days. The tabernacle to Molech and Chun images. He despises them. History doesn't look too good. This slide is all for 785 BC. These are Israel's pagan feasts. We've already gone through these scriptures in quite a bit of detail in other studies. In Amos 8:5, this around 785, like I'm saying, it says, saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying balances by deceit. And this is talking about your feasts will be bitter. These are not Yahuwah's feasts. Israel, or the 10 northern tribes, were not following Yahuwah's months or honoring his Sabbaths as they should have been. Yes, the phrase new moon should have been translated as new month, but the context qualifies this as a pagan new month, not Yahuwah's new month. We know this for sure because the rebellion from their midst was not honoring the Sabbath, and this apostasy had gone on for a very long time. And then down in Hosea 2, about the same time frame, it says, I will also cause her mirth or her joy to cease. This is Yahuwah speaking. I will cause her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all of her solemn feasts to cease. And the her is talking about the pagan feast days, the pagan new moons, and the pagan Sabbaths. Also in Hosea 2, verses 8 to 17, it's telling us that Israel's offerings were prepared for Baal with the burning of incense. And in Hosea 3:1, The children of Israel were looking to other gods, and they loved the raisin cakes of the pagans. So Israel's pagan feast-keeping was a huge snare to their worship. It gets worse before it gets better. Between 760 to 740 BC, we have the abominations of Ahaz. We've done this verse as well in Isaiah 1, 13 to 14, where it says, "Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and the Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with it. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They are a trouble unto me, and I'm weary to bear them." So this is 25 years later. The 10 northern tribes are being warned by Isaiah to get rid of this pagan worship, and he specifically mentions again your new moons and your appointed feasts because they are pagan celebrations. They are not Yahuwah's. He wants them to drop that and to get back on to covenant calendar and covenant worship. 10 years later in Micah, there's transgressions of Samaria and Jerusalem, back to graven images and idols. 10 years later, in 2 Chronicles 28, we have Judah's king Ahaz. He's making molten images for Balaam. These are sun gods. He's burning incense in the high places, in the hills, and under every tree. He's burning his children in the fire as the heathens do. He sacrificed to the gods of Damascus, made altars in high places to burn incense to other gods, all kinds of things. And also in Hosea 10, Israel's goodly images and altars are talked about, and they're still sacrificing to Balaam and burning incense to graven images. The Old Testament is just filled with pagan abominations and worship. From 725 to 710 BC, we're going to be looking at King Hoshea, King Manasseh, and King Hezekiah. Hezekiah actually tried to do some reform here. He was breaking down the images and cutting down the groves and the high places, and don't think he cleaned it all up, though he got some of it done. Also in 725, Ephraim is sinning with molten images of silver and many, many idols. A few years later in 721, in 2 Kings 17, King Hoshea is setting up images in groves and high places. He's serving idols. He's made 2 molten calves. He's worshiping all the host of heaven, and the whole kingdom is serving Baal. In 720, this is approximately the time that the 10 northern tribes of Israel are scattered by Assyria because they're fearing the other gods. Yahuwah had to do something. He had to split it up. In 715, Manasseh comes along, plays the harlot, follows the gods of the people of the land. In Isaiah 10, approximately 715, there's a prophecy to Isaiah that Jerusalem is worse than Samaria with her idols, her graven images. We are going to talk about Judah and the southern kingdom in the next lesson, but I want you to remember this, that Jerusalem is worse than Samaria, basically worse than all of the 10 tribes of Israel. In 710 BC, King Hezekiah really does make an effort to clean up all the idols, the groves, and the images. And in Micah 5, it also has a warning that Israel's graven images will be destroyed. They will not worship the work of their hands. What will happen in the next 300 years of history? This is what Yahweh says. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths and ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not walk in it. The ancient history shows the abominations that was going on, and yet they said they would do it, then they said, no, we won't. Approximately 700 years before, both Moses and Joshua had given very firm and strict counsel to Israel. Don't be enticed by the pagans and their gods for sun worship and moon worship. It isn't going to be worth it. Israel said, well, they wouldn't do it, but then they didn't heed the counsel. And this is basically their sad history with rounds of pagan bondage and cries for deliverance throughout the whole Old Testament. They got into trouble, and when they cried, Yahuwah delivered them, but they always went back. Next, Yahuwah has to step in with 2 signs to see if he can't move his people to follow his ways for the next 700 years. What are those 2 signs? Right now, I'd like to leave a few minutes, if we have a few minutes, for some audience participation. We only have about 4 slides after this. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the backsliding ways of Israel and their worship of pagan gods. And what do you think Yahuwah should do after all that has happened? If there's any comments, you can give them here. We'll take a few.
Charlene, it's Vivian here. I just happened to be watching some YouTubes on the British Isles, and in the Iron Age, there still was sacrifices, human sacrifices.
Yes.
Yes. For
Human sacrifices are still going on today. It's kind of hush hush, but we know that there's a lot of children going missing, a lot of babies going missing. We don't want to get into that tonight. But this has all been recorded in the Old Testament for us, and nothing much changes, does it?
Yeah, Bohemian Grove. Tanya, you have your hand raised? Go ahead, Tanya.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Hold on, I have to turn my other phone off. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
We have about 6 minutes left. I think Charlene had a couple more slides too. Go ahead though, please.
Oh, Charlene, I just wanted to mention about the verse in Malachi. I think it's Malachi 2, where it mentions Judah marrying another god. Oh yeah, in verse 11, which I thought was interesting that, you know, because Abba talked about divorcing his people, but he goes into more specific in Malachi, stating that Judah didn't just profane the land in Jerusalem, but he also went and married a daughter of a foreign god. So I thought that was significant in what you were showing about these moon gods, the sun gods, and this pretty much specifically says that exactly in Malachi 2, verse 11.
Thank you for bringing that up. We haven't really touched on Judah and Jerusalem tonight. We were just mostly working with Israel and the 10 tribes. So we'll be doing the Judah Jerusalem history on the next presentation. So we'll probably expand that then. So if everyone can just remember that. That's a good thought. There's some surprises coming, I think. Okay, well, I'm just going to trust that we should keep moving here and get done, and if we have time for questions at the end. So what should Yahuwah do? Back to our question from the very beginning. Why would Yahuwah's people be enticed to exchange their worship for pagan gods? This has been a question that I've had for a long time, and I just don't get it. But maybe we have gods in our lives that we don't see, that we just honor every day. But about 701 BC, Yahuwah said, I can just see him saying this, enough is enough. I've got to do something about this. And it was Hezekiah's sundial miracle that is the next major event sent by Yahuwah to correct Israel's apostasy with the moon goddess. I really believe this is where things were supposed to turn around. And will that decision affect the calendar that they observe? This is the question. In the next study, we want to search for the answers to many questions with an investigation of Judah's history from about 700 to 400 BC And we're going to be looking about who else may be responsible for taking away keys to Yahuwah's covenant calendar. Because we've been saying for the last couple of lessons, who took away these keys of the kingdom? Who took away the keys of the covenant calendar? Well, we thought maybe Israel did, but what I'm finding is that Israel's 10 tribes only apostatized. They didn't really take away the keys. And Samaria, we thought maybe Samaria had something to do with it, but Samaria is part of Israel, and she apostatized too, pretty bad. Then there's Galilee. There was a question about, would Galilee do this? I guess we'll see, not tonight. And then we have to look at Judah. I'm just wondering what we'll find there. And then there's always, are there others that have taken away the keys? We're on the search to find who did away with Yahuwah's covenant calendar. And that's what we want to do next, is we want to find out who is guilty and what happened to Yahuwah's covenant calendar. I do hope that we can finish the moon component next time in part 9, or the moon, oh the moon, and I think I'm going to title it, My People Have Forsaken Me for the Moon. And hopefully, if Yahuwah wills, we'll do that on November the 16th. So that's the end of the presentation, everybody. If you have questions or whatever, you know how to get a hold of us. You can email us or phone us, or just get a hold of us. If you have any questions, maybe we can help you.
Thank you, Charlene. This has been packed full of information, a lot of stuff. You covered a lot of territory in a relatively short amount of time. I'd highly recommend looking through this a couple of times and maybe even creating a little chart in the back of our Bible so that we can, walk people through this. Clear, I think, in First Chronicles that you pointed out, there's no 13th month, so that can clear up some covenant challenges. If you're on a calendar of any kind that has a 13th month, or Adar Bet as it's called, you might want to reconsider looking through that. There's something wrong with that picture. I apologize for there not being a whole lot of times for question and answers, but I want to remind that you all that are viewing this, even on YouTube, Covenant Calendar Club members have a hangout every other week. The first and third weeks of the month are studies like this, and the other Fridays are just hangout times to discuss these kinds of things. So it's really a good time that we can share questions and that type of thing amongst each other. So if you're not a member of Covenant Calendar Club and would like to be, click on the link below the video, go to studythecalendar.com, and there'll be a place that you can join Covenant Calendar Club as well. So any other questions about the study tonight? We do have about 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes. Walter.
I just want to thank Charlene, because we have no idea how much work is in there.
Yes.
It's unbelievable. Just a few things that I do, and I mean, it's almost day and night that you have to, but that's a lot of research, and it's really much appreciated.
Yeah, me too.
Even my wife wants to say thank you.
Yes.
All right. That's the encouragement.
She sits right next to me.
Yeah, but she know me.
Well, we can praise our Heavenly Father. He's the one that gives us the wisdom and the time.
Amen.
Yes, Mario, you did make an interesting point there, and I didn't bring it out, and I probably should have. But a lot of the problems were fornication, adultery, sexual immorality that enticed the people. It was always adultery and then idolatry. And, just like when Balaam was asked to curse the children of Israel, he couldn't. Yahweh said, you're going to bless them, not curse them. But he did say, you know what, there is a way. There is a way to do this. Send the pagan women into the outside borders of the camp. So this was a problem too. And yes, when you said that Lot's 2 daughters and that chain of family came down from incest, there's a lot of problems that are linked to sexual immorality. And of course, the worship of Asherah, all those names of the moon goddess, it was completely about sexual immorality, completely, the whole thing. It's so sad. And that is still going on today. But thankfully, we have the word of Yahuwah. We know that we're not going to have any part of that. So
that'll be fine. Yeah.